International workers' solidarity. It's this foundational idea, right? That workers everywhere, from London to Lagos, are all in the same boat, fighting the same fight. But what if the actual history of one of the world's oldest labor movements tells a completely different and way more complicated story? Let's dig into the evidence from our source material and see if this belief really holds up. Our source material from author Yildirim Koç really throws down the gauntlet with this statement. He's basically saying that this popular image of a unified international working class is just a romantic fantasy that completely falls apart when you look at the history books. And he uses a pretty powerful case study to make his point. Okay, so here's our game plan for breaking this down. First, we're going to look at that ideal of internationalism that's being challenged. Then we'll dive right into the British case study and explore what the author calls a history of complicity. After that, we'll see how this whole dynamic might be playing out today through the lens of international aid, before we get to the author's really stark conclusion.
All right, first things first. Let's really get a handle on the ideal itself. And, it's a powerful concept. It's been a cornerstone for labor movements for generations, this incredible vision of global unity against a common enemy.
So, at its heart, internationalism is this idea that the lines on a map, they don't matter as much as the shared experience of being a worker. It's a vision of a united global front. But here's the thing. Our source material argues that for one of the world's most influential labor movements, this has pretty much just stayed a vision, not a reality. And that brings us to the heart of the argument, the British case study. Now, you might be wondering, why Britain? Well, as home to one of the oldest and, for a long time, most powerful labor movements on the planet, it should be the perfect test for this whole ideal of internationalism. And this really tees up the central question that the author is posing here. Does the actual historical record of the British working class support this ideal of international solidarity? Or does it, tell a totally different story? To really get why this argument is so significant, you have to understand the sheer scale we're talking about. The author makes a point to say the working class isn't some fringe group in Britain. We're talking about roughly 90% of the entire workforce. That's over 25 million people. So this analysis isn't about some small faction. It's about the dominant economic class of a major world power. Now, the author first points to what looks like a crack in the foundation of solidarity right at home. Union membership, which is a huge indicator of organized labor, has just plummeted. From a high of over 55% back in 1979 to just 22% today. So the author poses a really critical question. If a class can't even maintain unity within its own borders, how can we really expect it to be a unified force on the international stage? And that question about domestic unity? Well, it's the perfect launchpad into the historical core of the argument, the very complicated relationship between British labor and the British Empire. You have to ask, during the peak of its global power, what role did the average British worker really play? According to the source, the timeline reveals a pattern of getting more and more involved, not pushing back. It starts in the late 1800s with a kind of passive acceptance of colonialism. By the 1920s, there's a clear lack of support for major independence movements in places like Turkey and India. And then the big one in 1929, unions actually joined government committees to manage the colonies. The source argues that even after World War II, when the empire was starting to crumble, this supportive stance from the mainstream labor movement just continued. So what you end up with is this really stark contrast. On one hand, you have the ideal. Workers of the world unite. On the other hand, you have the historical reality, at least as the author presents it, where the British labor movement didn't fight imperialism, but actually worked within its framework, trying to control, not liberate, other colonial unions. Okay, but you might be thinking that was the age of empire. Surely things have changed in the modern era, right? Well, the analysis then pivots to a more contemporary form of international relations, so-called aid and solidarity projects. To make this point about modern solidarity, the author looks at who was actually funding the international projects of the Trades Union Congress, or TUC. And the data presented is, well, it's pretty striking. Between 1998 and 2000, a staggering 88% of the money for these projects came directly from the British government. Only 12% came from the unions themselves. But the author doesn't stop there. He takes this argument a step further and makes a really serious claim. The source contends that this state-funded aid had nothing to do with genuine solidarity. Instead, it was about two things: keeping unions in developing countries under Western influence and, believe it or not, acting as a tool for gathering intelligence. And to bring it all into the present day, the author looks at the official stance of the TUC today. By seeing employers as social partners instead of class enemies, and by taking no official position against massive global institutions like the IMF or NATO, the analysis suggests the TUC has become totally integrated into the existing power structure, not a force to challenge it. So, where does all this leave us? What does all this evidence actually add up to? Well, the author's conclusion ties all these historical and modern threads together for a pretty sobering reassessment of worker solidarity. And here it is, the core thesis of the source material laid out plain and simple. The argument is that the British working class, far from being an ally to colonized people, was actually a junior partner in the imperial project. That the higher standard of living, the democratic rights they enjoyed, all of it was partly paid for by the exploitation of the colonies. And that brings us full circle, back to the author's own powerful words. He concludes that to ignore this history, to ignore the economic realities of empire, and to still cling to this romantic idea of internationalism is, as he puts it, to live in a dream world. And that leaves us with a final, really challenging question. If this analysis is on the right track, what would genuine international solidarity actually require from workers in wealthy nations today? It's a question that goes right to the heart of what it means to be a worker in our globalized world.